Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today for SNF Agora Conversations. I'm Scott Shane, a former reporter for the New York Times, and I'm now an SNF Agora Visiting Scholar. They use the word scholar very loosely here. The SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins is an academic center and public forum dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. And between now and the presidential election in just a month, we're going to be having a series of conversations that will consider specific current threats to American democracy, while also looking for moments of democratic resilience and possible paths forward. In 2020, as you know, in addition to deciding who to vote for, Americans also have to sort through all kinds of rumor and partisan bickering just to figure out how to cast a vote. After the presidential debate this week, I thought this can't get any crazier. And then overnight, as you all know, a story broke that the president and first lady had tested positive for coronavirus just days after a debate in which the president had ridiculed his opponent for always wearing a mask. We're extraordinarily lucky to have with us today some real all-stars, Astead, Herndon, and Pomerantsev. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, our third panelist, Jackie Calmes, had to drop out to handle a torrent of news today because she's the White House editor at the Los Angeles Times. Let me just say a little bit about our two panelists. Astead Herndon is one of the stalwarts on the New York Times political team this year, turning out a remarkable number of insightful campaign stories and somehow finding time to break other news at the same time. His ability to interview folks who might be considered hostile to a New York Times reporter, like at Trumpstock last year, a Woodstock-style gathering of hardcore Trump fans, has really amazed me. And Astead also has a black belt in Twitter. Just now, I saw him declaring that people speculating that Trump's diagnosis is a deliberate distraction. He called that rumor or that speculation a symptom of galaxy brain rot. Astead, thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Speaking of experts on galaxy brain rot, Peter Pomerantsev is one of the most astute chroniclers of disinformation out there, starting with his wild account of his experience working for Russian TV with the great title, "Nothing is True and Everything is Possible." And in his new book, "This Is Not Propaganda: Adventures in the War Against Reality," another great title that sort of speaks for itself, he's bringing an exciting project on disinformation called Arena to Johns Hopkins, where he's a fellow at the SNF Agora Institute, and appreciate your joining us too, Peter, from London.
My pleasure.
So the three of us will spend maybe about a half hour discussing media, social media, misinformation, disinformation in this fraud election season. And we'll try to produce a model for lively but civil discussion in time for Trump and Biden's next presidential debate, if Trump can show up. Guys, if I say, "Will you shut up, man?" well, that's a signal that maybe you should let someone else talk. And then we'll open it up for questions. Anytime throughout this conversation, you can submit your question through the dialog box, which is right next to the video or just below it, depending on the device you're using today. So Astead is under deadline pressure, so we're particularly appreciative of his joining us. So I'm going to start with you, Astead, and throw you a question. Judging from your encounters with voters and the kind of political operative types who talk to a lot of voters, and recognizing that this year a lot of your encounters have been virtual, how do you think voters are doing in making sense out of the unprecedented flood and polarization of news and opinion, rumors, spin, fabrication, and other nonsense? You know, what's the status of the voter as all this stuff comes at them?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I mean, I think that this is a kind of kind of core to what this year is going to be about. I mean, you have voters who are having to wade through a ton of information, not only one is that is given to them in good faith, but also a torrent of bad faith information, some of which is not something that they know for themselves to be bad faith. I think that the first thing that in going out and talking to people that you understand is just how kind of airtight those bubbles and silos of information are. And so I could think about when going to Trump rallies and talking to kind of the Trump stock event, you think of, you have to be really fluent in the kind of language of that the Trump voter is speaking, the kind of bubble of conservative media and information that they're coming from, from not only the Fox News cable host, but the kind of Facebook group ecosystem, the gateway pundits of the world, the kind of way it filters up into Fox News actually produces a huge kind of separate news cycle that kind of hard base understands. And I think if you're going to want to gain their trust or even understand the issues that are animating them, you have to understand that also. I think that that is kind of oftentimes separate from what we would define as the regular kind of problems that of voters are coming into to understand the election. You know, how they are understanding fact checks and what news outlets they trust and the like. And I think that's just true of the electorate and at large. That whether media has trust and whether these kind of issues have been like verified independently is one that every voter is going to have to understand. But I think the kind of first place to know is the different kind of silos of information that the different bases are coming to, because particularly you have a president now that speaks that language of the base even more so than he speaks the language of what we would call kind of a traditional Washington or traditional mainstream media. So, I mean, I think that how are voters doing depends on who you ask. I mean, some folks are just not, it is not their, the kind of ways that we would say you need to get information, that is not their priority because they are seeking that bubble, which is easily found.
So are you finding that people want to talk about or are talking about or are confused about just the mechanics of voting? We do have a president who keeps telling us that the way millions of Americans are going to vote this year is fraudulent, mail-in voting. And, Democrats dismiss that. But then, you see stories like the one a couple days ago about 100,000 ballots that were mailed out in Brooklyn being marked with the wrong names and just generally screwed up. So it is a kind of baffling situation at least from my point of view.
I mean, yeah, you have a system that is being tested, and that's without the words of the president, right? Like there is a unprecedented kind of transformation in the voting process that has taken place and that has produced some error. And so I think that there are kind of just general concerns, kind of service-driven concerns that a lot of voters have about participating. Where do I get my ballot? How do I return it? Where does that need to go? Will it be counted? Those are all fair questions that I think it's incumbent on kind of states and the localities that run our elections to ask of folks. You have a separate thing about the kind of bad faith attacks you see, particularly coming from the president, who was citing unproven and undocumented problems to sow distrust. And so I think that is something different than the kind of is this, where do I make this happen? Where do I make sure my ballot counts? When someone's saying, no, there's an intentional system at play trying to make your ballot not count. And I think that that's the kind of tension that we have seen, is that, do people trust the system? By large, yes. Is that enough to stop us from having a real kind of crisis of democracy and of trust come election day? No. If 30-40% of the country believes that a result that doesn't go their way or that does not look a certain way is not a valid one, that's a real problem, whether that is a minority of people or not. And so I think that both of those things can be true: the sowing of distrust and the kind of folks who are coming to this trying to seek, kind of normal questions about and normal concerns about what is a really transformed process.
Yeah, very well put. Well, we're going to go global with Peter in a minute, but let me ask you, since you're pressed for time, how do you think, to make this extremely topical, how do you think the media should be covering, in the sort of political context that we're in right now, Trump's coronavirus infection? Not to mention, the First Lady, the chairwoman of the Republican Party, and Lord knows who else will be announced by the end of the day. You see a lot of back and forth out there on Twitter. I was amazed to see Rachel Maddow of MSNBC, not a fan of the president, say seemingly quite sincerely that she's praying that everyone should pray for Trump and the First Lady. Anyway, but how do you think? What are the hazards here, and how do you think the media should be covering this?
Yeah, I think we got to let the kind of tone stuff and well-wishes stuff stick to the political parties. I mean, I think that there is a kind of crisis of democracy, and I think that to the extent that I don't think we need to over-extrapolate something, but we should go ahead with what we know. I mean, we know that the White House is saying that there was a positive test and that they've experienced mild symptoms. We know the kind of guidelines that come next per the public health experts, that they should be quarantining, that they should have limited contact with folks. I think there's a kind of accountability point and a personal public health point to see, will the White House follow through on those guidelines? I think all of that stuff is kind of fair. There's obviously a point about Joe Biden. Should they have that debate in 2 weeks? Is that within the guidelines? How many negative tests do we need from the president to know that the virus has passed from him? I think those are open questions that are fair for folks to kind of ask, because this is the kind of leader of the country going through what we know to be a health crisis in which he is in the vulnerable populations for. But I think what's also important is what we don't know. And I don't think that we should engage in the kind of, hyper partisan or political speculation, something that really that goes further than saying, hey, this is the kind of limitations of our reporting and understanding, and saying stuff that drifts more into punditry. Oh, this could hurt or help him. This could do, that's not stuff that's clear yet. And so I think, especially with this type of moment where trust is so fraught, to stick within that kind of realm of fact-based reporting and accountability is going to be really important.
So that kind of preempts my next question, which is, will this hurt him or help him? I will hold off on that one, but thanks a lot. Let me turn to Peter. And Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut, said yesterday that an octopus-like Russian election interference operation is being run on Trump's behalf that exceeds what Russia did in 2016. And H.R. McMaster, who served for 2 years as Trump's national security advisor, said Trump is aiding and abetting Putin's interference campaign. An amazing statement from a former, White House comrade of the president. I wonder what you could tell us about your impression. Is that hyperbolic? Do we really know enough to say that? What do you think Russia is doing in 2020? It took us a year to figure it out last time, but from what you see and what you hear, what your hunch is, what do you think Russia is up to this time around?
Well, golly, I mean, unlike 4 years ago, we now have a tech sector that promises to look out for this. We now have a whole community of investigators and journalists thinking about this. So we are in a very different place from 2016. But again, I think there's two things that people are looking at very intensely. One is kind of the next level of the social media campaigns, which is really have seemed to become much more sophisticated. They don't seem to be these kind of like rather, in retrospect, quite cheeky and mean, but really quite primitive, like bot farm campaigns. Like, let's do, let's support a piece of disinformation with 1,000 retweets from a guy sitting in St. Petersburg. The tech companies have become a lot better at looking for that kind of coordinated and authentic behavior, as they call it, that kind of deceptive online behavior. It seems to be much more sophisticated now, creating websites, creating news sources, which look as if they're alternative news sources, hiring real journalists, doing real stories, but then tilting the kind of agendas and framings around stuff that's profitable for the president, it's always very hard to understand the effectiveness of those operations because they are, by definition, playing into existing biases. You know, they tend to just be very, very partisan. And it's very hard to understand how they move the needle because they are already playing inside a created echo chamber. Much more dangerous are these operations which seed a kind of a major piece of, a major influence of essentially into the discourse. So last time it was the hack and leak campaign, which I really have to stress, the reason that hack and leak campaign, which is the hacking of the Podesta emails and the leaking of it, the reason that became such a big issue was because mainstream media, good media, were raising that issue in the debates, were covering that inside their own news sources. This time there seems to be a campaign run through Russian assets in Ukraine to smear Joe Biden, maybe through the Hunter Biden-Burisma connection. But, you know, that whole Trump, Biden is corrupt line. Again, what happened last time was that these issues were then raised and focused on in the debates by mainstream media who would consider themselves highly professional and like to think of themselves as objective and unbiased. So it's really a test for them. Will they take the bait again like they did last time or not? That's really the bit that gets me worried. This kind of social media stuff, it's cheeky, it's mean, but does it really change anything? I'm not so sure. It really is up to, the New York Times, CBS, NBC, ABC. Are they going to fall for it?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That the hacking and leaking were a much bigger deal last time than the social media thing, which was entertaining, but may not have been such an influential thing. I think the problem is if some real documents that have been hacked and are relevant to one campaign or the other are leaked in the last days of the campaign, it does pose a real dilemma for the mainstream media, for the normal media, because it's news. And so how do we get away from that? And, in connection with that, let me just turn back to Astead and ask you a very broad question. But what grade would you give the media for election coverage this year? And I'll let you decide how to define that increasingly vague term, the media, which sometimes seems to stretch from the New York Times to Uncle Fred's Facebook comments.
Yeah.
But if you could just sort of characterize how we're doing with that. The media took a lot of heat last time in 2016 from some quarters for what some consider to be excessive focus on Hillary Clinton's use of a private server for her email as Secretary of State, and in other quarters for the sort of uncritical amplification of the Russians hacked Democratic emails and so on. How are the media doing this year, would you say?
I would say it's an improved media. I think partly there was a lack of imagination or possibility last time that Trump could be elected president, that we weren't just having this campaign that was a kind of informal trial. Informal trial for Clinton, and that you were basically getting a head start on covering her and holding her accountable. I think that also when we talk about the distance between the powerful, also I think it was a unique time, and there was some just level of ignorance about how to deal with these type of misinformation campaigns. I would also say that there was and I think this is true for voters and not just media too, there is a closer connection between the perception of Hillary Clinton and the kind of caricature of Hillary Clinton that was being pushed. And then there is this time around the candidate in being Joe Biden and the kind of caricature being pushed. I think some of that has to do with sexism. Some of that has to do with her years in government. And I think the ability for folks to latch on to a corrupt Hillary narrative was one that was baked in for decades before there was a social media, one that was baked in before there was a WikiLeaks. I mean, that has been a charge that has been centered around her for a long, long time, and a back and forth that media has been having with her for a long time. I think that primed people to take things that they may not have looked back and done now a little more, give it a little more credence. But all in all, I think the kind of biggest difference here is a Donald Trump who is president and no longer a kind of amorphous challenger. And I think that has kind of focused attention on this is a referendum on this administration. And so things like Hunter Biden are worth being explored, and there's been good journalism about that, but it's not being elevated to the point where I think we might have seen previously. There has been some Senate investigations or things into that haven't been given the kind of treatment that I think the kind of 4 years ago stuff was. I think part of that is growth, learning, and I think a part of that is kind of catching up to where the kind of misinformation and disinformation tactics of the moment are.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I mean, I think there is a bit of analogy between Crooked Hillary in 2016 and Demented Joe. The kind of the stuff that you have seen for months now, all over right-wing Twitter, for example, with Biden gaffes and many comments suggesting that he is haplessly crippled by this. And Peter, isn't that the theme that Russian disinformation operations are supposedly trying to amplify? The kind of Biden is over the hill, can't think straight, can't speak straight, doesn't know where he is. Isn't that the message that the Russians are picking up?
Most of the time, these Russian kind of troll farm campaigns, if that's what you mean, they will just pick up on anything that's trending and look to amplify it. And, if they're being clever, maybe try to spread it to an audience they feel is vulnerable to it. We just don't know the level of sophistication and audience analysis that they're really doing. We have a lot of speculation, but we don't really know. We don't know whether, we still don't know whether when Manafort was giving Kalimnik voting data in 2016, whether that was then fed into the troll farm. So, they'll just pick up anything and try to amplify it. I mean, their long-term aim is to, spread division, whatever. That's kind of an obvious one. But what we see consistently is they'll find an audience, they'll work on it for many, many years, and then they'll start feeding it material that's advantageous to Russia, often to do with Ukraine or international agreements or Syria. So that's part of their plan as well, to embed themselves within existing narratives and then implant their own narratives there. They're not always just looking at the election. So they have a much more longer term game that they're playing. So they'll jump on various issues. Again, as I say, the social media campaign stuff, it's been fantastic, I think, uncovering that, because it's led to a lot of important questions being asked about social media companies. It was really the Russian investigation which led to Zuckerberg, Twitter, all these people being called to Congress, called to British Parliament. So it's been fantastic in opening up these really important questions around the social media space and how we want to regulate it, and how do we see this new public sphere. But in and of themselves, when we're talking about countries like America or Western countries generally, I wouldn't over panic about that stuff. However, the hack and leak stuff, that has, I think, had an impact, and I think that's really much more important.
Mm-hmm. Very good, Astead. Let me ask you, out of curiosity, as an American political reporter with an American focus, does all the talk about foreign disinformation, election meddling, Russia, usually focused on Russia, does that strike you as sort of hyperbolic and irrelevant, or does it strike you as a serious threat to American elections?
I mean, I don't know if I have the expertise to kind of prioritize the threats to American elections. I mean, I don't think it is something that we can dismiss. I think if you want to be an American political reporter, you have to understand the kind of context to which our elections are framed in, and the actors who are seeking to disrupt that. And I think that all the evidence we have is that is something that has both been targeted and been to at various instances successful. And I think that is one of many factors that I think we should be aware of. I do think that there is a willingness for some in America to pretend as if the phenomenon of Donald Trump is one that is someone else's fault. And I think that I think there is a risk for that, and ignoring the very American-born and bred context and issues that have helped him become president. And so I definitely think that there was certainly in the initial year or so a reliance on some, even in Democratic spaces or some in the Republican Party, to say that this was the act of someone else, that this was purely ascribed to a kind of foreign intervention rather than him running on things that had real resonance among a certain slice of Americans, or Hillary Clinton missing a certain slice of Americans. And I think that is not, I think that is not something you can do. I think what you can do is understand that it is part of a larger context of different kind of modes of information and the ways that folks are attacking that. And just as the kind of intentional, the intentional tactics by foreign actors are involved, so are the kind of implicit roles that social media companies play, and in terms of information. And that's a big factor. So is the kind of erosion of trusted local media news throughout the country that people used to go to for those, and where that's a factor. I think that these things can all be true at one time.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very well put. There's a whole lot of powerful American players in this thing before you even consider any Russian role, any foreign role. I know you got to scoot here in a minute, but we have a few questions coming in from the audience. And let me pitch one to you before you run. Mm-hmm. This person asks, in the modern news business, where journalists get rewarded for clicks on their pieces, are the incentives for journalists not aligned with seeking full facts over publishing incomplete scoops, or, frankly, scoops that turn out to be bogus?
Yeah, I think that this is really overrated. I mean, I think it's a kind of meaning
as a force in media.
Yeah, I think that it's a kind of 2000 early internet view that like journalists are specifically being driven for whatever is like has the most SEO clicks, and that their whole employment is tied to that. I mean, I think that what we know is that certainly that is a factor. Certainly news organizations are trying to drive interest to their site and to their work. And I think that's been true throughout a long time. I think that creates certainly an incentive to be fast. I think that's certainly an incentive to be clear. But I think that what we also have seen is that getting things wrong erodes your credibility. And that also ruins audience also. And that when you don't have things that are contextual or proven, or when you have things that are proven to be accurate, folks don't come back to you that next time. They don't come back to you as a trusted source of information. And so I think for any outlet who is interested in being seen as that, there is no great incentive. I mean, there is balancing incentives between being quick and being accurate, but it is not one where you're fully willing to punt the context and accuracy that you strive for out of the name of being fast, because the punishment of that is still very great. And I think that that's not something that is fully maybe understood in terms of the outside. Yes, the folks want to get clicked on. Yes, you want to drive interest, but in the way of I think it's different than social media, right? In the way that someone can live off retweets of a factually bad information and not really be punished by that. News organizations, news outlets have a reputation that is tied to that view of accuracy, and are in many cases, or at least I can say in my experience in the modern news industry, understand that eroding that is not something that's good long term, even financially.
Yeah, in a sense, I would say that it has been good for the New York Times as a business that there's all this nonsense out there, because people get, they want something they can rely on, and they come to a place like the Times because they know it's edited, they know it's vetted, they know it's checked out. Do you have time for one more question before you run?
Yeah, I can probably do one more. Okay.
Here's a good one. Do you consider 20,000 lies from President Trump disinformation? I guess this person is obviously referring to, at least by the Washington Post's count of false and misleading statements from Trump, it's more than 20,000. The mail-in ballot claims of rampant fraud seems to be affecting many and many in his own party. What would you say about that?
I consider it disinformation that's affecting those in his own. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's any question. I mean, it's false, right? And so to the extent that we define disinformation as something that is a known falsehood or lie that changes folks' actions or kind of intentionally is said in a political context for a desired result, then certainly the president falls under that category. I mean, he has a political incentive to erode trust in the system. It is a system that he is worried will not turn out to its outcome. And it is one that Republicans understand that in that certain populations coming to the ballot process is not good for their result. And so I think that this happens in a long history of disinformation and suppression tactics around voters. But this is talking about the whole kind of basis of the electoral system. I think that makes Trump unique in that kind of willingness to attack it. But I don't think it makes him it's totally outside the line of kind of politicians we have seen previously. But is it disinformation? Absolutely. And I think that that is what we have seen be the biggest barrier for folks in terms of disinformation from coronavirus or disinformation around the electoral system, is that the most important actor in our political system is the source of it at this moment. And that has a political bend to it. There might be reasons of why that is. He might be reflecting the conservative media bubble that he himself is in. But we know for a fact that there are folks who have changed their actions around voting and about the virus because of the words he has said.
Very well put. We usually apply the term disinformation, it seems like, to the other, meaning the foreigners, but it really does apply in this case. Listen, Astead, Herndon, thank you again for making time in a ridiculous day. Go out there and write your political column, and we'll all read it tonight or tomorrow. And hang in there, get a little sleep from time to time.
I appreciate it. Thank y'all so much.
Thanks for your great work. Take care now. Okay, Peter, it's you and me now. Astead is terrific. He's really one of the best young political reporters out there. And, he was having multiple Zoom calls with editors this morning who really didn't want him to do this. So I really appreciate him taking a half hour. Let me turn back to Peter and ask you a sort of, well, let me ask you first another foreign meddling question, which is, you have undoubtedly seen the statements from the US government, which to my way of thinking have been very carefully worded, because they're coming, they have to get them past President Trump, I suppose. But they try to accuse Russia of engaging in election-related disinformation while kind of balancing it with Iran and China. But the specifics are often about Russia to the degree they exist. It seems to be much more of a concrete thing. With Iran and China, it seems much more theoretical that they might want to do this, or they might have a strategy. I just wonder what you make of the role of Iran and China this year, particularly in the election kind of stuff. And is that just window dressing so that the administration folks and the government folks don't have to pin the blame entirely on Russia, or is Iran and China sort of learning the game now and getting involved?
So look, China has always been involved domestically in terms of these, if we're talking about these kind of digital disinformation campaigns that we associate with Russia. China's always done this domestically and it's near abroad. It's been very active in Taiwan for many years. Now we see them, especially after the Hong Kong riots, and now in relation to the Uyghur issues, we see them expanding. One would assume they would expand more aggressively into America, especially as America and China take on a more confrontational pose. Certainly the message of myself and other people who looked at the Russian interference was always, look, Russia's doing it now, but this is just the new normal. And this is why we need, different forms of regulation around these issues, and much more awareness from the media community, and kind of a doctrine of political warfare in the 21st century. What is the proportionate response to a disinformation campaign? What does one do? Let off a stink bomb in Yekaterinburg? I mean, we don't really know. What's the diplomatic response? What's the norms response? How do we define it? While working within our democratic values of freedom of expression. So look, this is just the beginning of this stuff. Everyone's going to be doing it. I mean, at ARENA, which is our little research initiative at Hopkins, we've monitored elections in Germany and Sweden. Russia is always very, very present, though actually in Sweden it wasn't at all. But everybody's at it now. This is the new normal. Extremist groups. Somebody sitting in their basement, playing around with dirty marketing campaigns, different states, religious groups. I mean, everybody is doing this. So we are in for a cluster mess of influence operations. Everyone's trying to do it. The Russians are a major player. Obviously, a state has more resources. They can do it in a bigger scale. But this is the new normal. And we really have to work out what is our kind of cultural and legal way of making sense of this mess.
Let me ask you I guess this is sort of a psychological question. Why do conspiracies that seem to scream, this is bogus to most of us, and have no evidence to support them, travel so far and get such a hold? Takes something like QAnon, which posits that prominent Democrats in the US are somehow running a child sex abuse ring. It's crazy, but thousands or maybe even millions of people seem to believe it or want to believe it. It perplexes a lot of people that there is such a phenomenon. What explains that? Why do people want to believe stuff like this?
So listen, I don't think it's to do with epistemology. I think all the research we can see about conspiracy theories, they're about identity formation and group identity identification. And people who believe in conspiracy theories jump from one to the next. It's not the epistemological value of it. It's not about it's not a serious argument about knowledge. It's a way of saying we're in this group together. We believe this together. Maybe sort of religious movements can play a similar role, and nobody really tries to fact check the Old Testament or haven't. And if they do, they're going to get very confused. I'm about to celebrate Sukkot, the Jewish festival of Sukkot. I'm about to run around with some twigs, shaking them. None of this is to do with knowledge. It's about identity. It's about a shared set of values. So listen, I really don't think conspiracy is necessarily about knowledge. It's about these much more interesting dynamics. Very interesting looking at Poland, for example. In Poland, what defined people voting for the current government was their belief in a conspiracy theory about the taking down of an airplane that killed a lot of politicians quite a few years ago. And no amount of evidence saying how unfounded that idea is will move that. It's not about the evidence. It's about feeling that you're part of a group. So the question is, why is that so prevalent now? I mean, in my last book, I thought about this a little bit, and I'd like to think about it a lot more in my research going forward. In a time where old social identities are disappearing, where old forms of life are disappearing, where we're all caught up in this churn of innovation that we call globalization and technological change, old identities give way, and people are desperate for new ones. That's then sort of hyperpowered by the internet, which can spread these new in and out groupings. So, in a world where left-right definitions have crumbled, in a world where sociological categories have gone, where whole ways of life are disappearing, conspiracies are a new way to create that group identity. So I think that's what it's really about. And when we think about penetrating these echo chambers and talking to these people, I think we have to think about that. It's pointless screaming at them that what you believe is nonsense. It's not about that. It's trying to understand, okay, what drove you to want to be in this community? Those are the questions that we have to look at.
So in a way, these campaigns are just another engine of tribalism in a very, very tribalized world.
I think that's really what they're about, much more than the epistemological case. I mean, it's very noticeable how people who believe in conspiracies jump from one to another. When one becomes ridiculous, like Pizzagate, they'll move on to QAnon, and from that they'll move on to something else. And it really isn't about that. It's about the sense of tribalism. That's one way of looking at it.
Yeah. So we have a few more minutes. Let me pose another audience question to you, which is basically, what advice do you have for two groups of Americans? One is Americans who have some kind of a sphere of influence, people in public life. How should they behave, so to speak, in this, extremely polarized, extremely chaotic sort of election period? And how should ordinary Americans make sense of it all? What would your advice be for just a regular American who's kind of being battered by this stuff on cable, on social media, and wants to just get through the election, figure out how to vote, who to vote for, and go on with their lives? What advice would you have for those two parties?
So listen, the first party, look, I'm not in America. I'm meant to have moved to America in September because of COVID. That's all been delayed. And all I can tell Americans about the international experience. And in the international experience, whether it's Russia, Hungary, Ukraine, also Britain to a certain extent, and I can see the same things happening now in Italy and Germany, a terrible thing happened that, people who believe in liberal democracy got caught in their own echo chamber, and they stopped listening, exploring, and communicating with the rest of the country. Sometimes that was enforced, like in Russia, and my first book is all about that. But there was a moment where people who believed in liberal democracy could have reached out to the rest of Russia in, late 90s, early 2000s, and didn't, and allowed themselves to be kind of put into a polarized tribe by the government. Now it's, these things are also married with fierce authoritarian tactics. But in Britain, seemingly right-thinking liberal Democrats allowed themselves to get caught in their own bubble. And we have a huge responsibility for not letting that degrade any further in trying to overcome that. So I dream of the moment when a CNN editor gets up in the morning and starts thinking, how do I engage Fox News viewers? How do we start a dialogue with them? Maybe they're not all Fox viewers. Maybe we shouldn't all put them in one bucket. Maybe that's already a mistake. Maybe we should start segmenting them and understanding them much better and seeing who we can engage with. So, that's something for the people who have some sort of power over our discourse to think about and wrestle with their own conscience. And then ordinary people, even though all of us are now public figures. Social media has made us all into mini propagandists. Every time we like or retweet something or say something on social media, we are now public figures. I think that line has become very blurred. But I think you actually describe the situation very well, where we all feel we're kind of attacked by all this hyper-partisan, very emotive content. It's almost, I think, the only advice that I have, it's almost like a spiritual technique. These systems, whether they're old legacy media, TV, or especially social media, they're trying to engage you emotionally in a very, very sort of base way. And I think it's almost like taking 10 breaths. And if you feel yourself getting enraged or overexcited, almost like kind of going into some Zen thing and pushing it away, finding your own little space, emotional space, coming back to it, and then thinking, okay, whoever has said this is trying to enrage me. They're trying to suck me into a very emotive reaction, and almost, almost like I think a kind of meditative or spiritual practice, pushing those emotions away and coming back to that nasty tweet or that nasty social media post and looking at it, push without any emotion and seeing, is it worth reacting to? Is there anything there? And if it is reacting to, how can one react to it in a way that is calm and collected? That is the only thing. Treating it as kind of a test that Yoda has sent to you, that you are not meant to react to, is, I think, the only way. Because the whole incentives, and largely commercial, but also political incentives, is to make you angry and to make you stop thinking. So that's the only thing, because until there is actual reform of the kind of the design of social media, especially, you know, we are going to be seeing actors try to press that hyper-partisan button as much as possible.
Well, we're just about out of time now, but it's interesting. Another question just came up that I think fits right in with your psychological analysis there. And this is really almost a comment rather than a question. If conspiracy theories thrive on group membership and collective identity, to what extent do political alienation and loneliness rather than political affiliation drive their proliferation? I think that's an interesting one. We're all sort of, you know, sitting in our, especially these days, sitting in our sort of COVID bunkers and maybe more susceptible than ever to all this emotional craziness. So listen, we're out of time. So let me now thank Astead, Astead Herndon, who's already fled to go back to work, and Peter Pomerantsev for this very interesting, very lively discussion. And thanks for the audience for showing up and for sending in some excellent questions. Please join SNF Agora again next Friday for Populism's second term. It's going to be modulated by SNF Agora Senior Fellow Yasha Monk. And the conversation will look at why populist leaders so often win re-election. What their second terms tend to look like, and why President Trump's fate might be different. You can find information about next week's webcast, as well as a recording of today's webcast on the SNF Agora website at snfagora.jhu.edu. We hope to see you again next week. And thanks to everybody. Stay safe out there and have a great week.